Hi everyone, this is Sam Ghosh and today we are going to talk about shared mobility in India. First, I will start with the socio-economic backdrop, then I will talk about the demand side, that is market for shared mobility in India, then supply side, then some policy issues and then the trends. Now, get started with the socio-economic backdrop. India is going through rapid urbanization. By 2030, more than 600 million people will be living in the cities, and by 2050, more than 50% of Indian population will be living in the cities. Also, the India is also experiencing rising incomes. As per McKinsey, roughly 60 million households could enter the consuming class by 2025. India has historically had low vehicle density, but with rising incomes there is a possibility of rising ownership of vehicles, and public transport has been insufficient, so that this can create a requirement for larger ownership of personal vehicles. Now, what is the problem with that? The first problem is pollution. India is home of some of the most polluted cities in the world. Delhi is the most polluted city in the world. The second problem is traffic congestion. Bengaluru, Mumbai, Pune and New Delhi, these four cities are among the top 10 congested cities in the world. Bengaluru at number 1. As per BCG, the cost of congestion in 4 metros was more than $22 billion. Indians spend 7% of their day in office commute, and because of the slower traffic speed. Another problem is parking space constraint. In Delhi, parking accounts for 8 to 10% of the available land pool. Now, let's think about the bigger economic picture. India imports most of its crude oil requirement, and it is the largest segment of imports. Transportation solely accounts for 48% of oil consumption in India. In India, this means a rising number of vehicles will give rise to the requirement for crude oils and the import. This will create problems with the balance of payment for the country. Now let's see this picture. We can see this picture basically shows that street space required to move same number of people by bike, car or bus. We can see that shared transportation, which is bus, compared to private vehicles, that is bike, that is motorbikes, and cars, a comparison between them. And we can see that shared transportation can solve a lot of problems for Indian cities. Congestion, also lower pollution. Now at the demand side, the first question we should ask, how should we measure demand for mobility? Should we measure the vehicles sold or owned, or should we measure the distance traveled by vehicles, or should we measure the distance traveled by the passengers? Now, if we consider mobility as utility, as utility, we have to consider the distance traveled by the passengers measured in form of, say, passenger kilometers traveled. Now we can see here that the passenger kilometers traveled, especially by road in India, has been growing rapidly at 14% on an average. The markets for different mobility services is also growing really fast. We can see that the ride-hailing market, we'll see the definition of this later. The ride-hailing market was at 428 million, ride-sharing at 552 million, and car rental at 98 million in 2018. And all these services are growing more than 25-30%. So ride hailing growing at 34%, ride sharing at 33-34%, and car rental at 26%, around 26%. Also, the two-wheeler sharing market is also growing at 20%. And although it is very small market, it is growing fast. McKinsey expects that India will be the third largest passenger vehicle market by 2021. Now let's see the broader demand for transportation in India. As we can see, India has been one of the fastest growing transportation market in the world. The passenger traffic is expected to grow about 15% per annum and reach 168,875 billion passenger kilometers in 2031-32 from merely 10,375 billion passenger kilometers in 2011-12. And 97% of this demand is for road transportation, will be for road transportation. The growth in rail transportation will be much slower compared to the road traffic. In the supply side, let's talk about the different business models. There are some business models are ride hailing, ride splitting, ride sharing, two-wheeler sharing, car sharing, and microtransit. Ride hailing is on-demand services that link riders to for-hire drivers who are using their own vehicles. For example, Uber and Ola. Ride splitting is algorithm-based splitting of ride between strangers. Uber Pool and Ola Share are examples. Ride sharing is different from ride splitting. It's similar to ride sourcing, that is ride hailing. In ride sharing, the trips are shared by travelers, but with that exception that drivers are not considered for hire. Two-wheeler sharing is an upcoming sector, and it can be docked, dockless, and peer-to-peer. Car sharing gives users access to vehicles as needed, that is for rental basically. For example, Zoom car. Microtransit is a private company operating shared vans where drivers and riders are linked via IT-enabled applications, for example, Shuttle. Now let's see some of the players in this sector. As per Frost & Sullivan, there are 30 companies in the shared mobility space in India. Ride-hailing is dominated by Ola and Uber with combined market share of 90%. Ride-sharing has 15 players in India. Ola and Uber dominate the intra-city ride-sharing, but the long-distance ride-sharing is dominated by a French company called BlaBlaCar. Car sharing was introduced in India by Zoom Car and is a market leader now with 70% market share. Two-wheeler sharing market is dominated by few players in bike taxi, rental, and bicycle sharing categories. Some of the major two-wheeler service providers are Rapido, Ola Bike, Uber Moto, Mobisi, Vogo, Bounce, etc. Now let's see the capacity and the growth in this sector. The fleet strength of ride-hailing services is growing really fast. As per Morgan Stanley, India had 257 billion miles driven in 2017, out of which 10% were shared, This is expected to increase to 35% by 2030. Ride-hailing apps are installed in more than 40% smartphones in India. Ola had around 24 million active monthly active users in November 2019 compared to 13 million of Uber. Bike sharing, with a fleet of 46,000 vehicles, 30,000 scooters, and 16,000 bicycles. Some of the policy concerns for this sector are promotion of shared mobility over ownership, complicated permit system, pricing, safety, and then e-rickshaws and two-wheeler taxis. So let's start with promotion of shared mobility over ownership. Private vehicles are the most underutilized assets that individuals purchase. Private cars are not utilized for 90% of the time. The average occupancy of a car is 28%. And shared mobility can actually solve this problem. Now, there has been some restrictions on the city taxi permits to control the number of taxis in cities. The scarcity of city taxis resulted in a surge in personal vehicle ownership in India, but also it created a misuse of all India taxi permits as city taxis. Now, there is an argument for dynamic pricing. Dynamic pricing can be actually helpful for managing demand and supply. For example, higher tariff at night helps make vehicles available at night in case of emergency, in case of disruption to public transport. This dynamic pricing can actually create availability. But there are problems like predatory pricing, such unreasonable surge pricing. This can be looked into. This should be looked into. Now, also excessive commissions charged by aggregators can also create imbalance in the system and scarcity in the long term. Scarcity of taxes in the long term. There are some safety concerns. Aggregators were found to be lacking proper background checks for drivers, risking the security of the passengers. Also, use of All India Tourist Taxi Permit for city taxis can create problems. And they do not comply with the regulations of the State Transport Department, and that is the problem. So, for example, there are requirements for fare regulations, GPS devices, etc. Now let's talk about e-rickshaws and two-wheeler taxis. Bike sharing and e-rickshaws can be used for last mile connectivity. Now let's see the regulatory progress till now. So let's get started with the Motor Vehicles Amendment Bill 2019. This bill first time defines aggregators as digital intermediaries or marketplaces which can be used by passengers to connect with a driver for transportation purposes. These aggregators can be issued license by states, and it also says that aggregators must comply with the Information Technology Act. There is also a draft Central Aggregator Guidelines 2019, which says that aggregators or the relevant state government can decide the base fare. It also proposes a cap on the commission structure, that is maximum 10% commission. It also proposes a cap on the surge pricing, that is two times of the base rate. It also proposes requirement of storage of data. It also proposes control system, 24/7 control system, requirement for 24/7 control system, grievance redressal centers, safe harbor provisions, facial recognition, etc. Now let's talk about the e-rickshaws and two-wheeler taxis. The Section 2A of the Motor Vehicles Act 1988 says the provisions of this act shall not apply to e-car and e-rickshaw. That means the e-rickshaws do not need any permit as per Section 66 of the Motor Vehicles Act. Statement to the Parliament. There is a statement to the Parliament. There was a statement to the Parliament which says that under the Motor Vehicles Act 1988, the states may issue permits for taxi under Section 72 and 73. That means, therefore, it is legal for the states to issue taxi permits of all kinds of vehicles, including two-wheelers. That means it is up to the states to decide and create the framework for issuance of permits for bike taxis, for example. Now let's talk about some of the trends in this sector. So we'll talk about three basic trends here: servitization of personal mobility, electric vehicles, and autonomous and connected mobility, and how these are linked with shared mobility. Let's get started with servitization of personal mobility. Now, traditionally, personal vehicles, especially car ownership, is considered to be a sign of financial success in India. But availability of shared mobility is changing that perception. This has a wide-ranging impact on the automobile industry. It can actually helpful for the automobile industry to think about changing the business models to leasing or renting out vehicles, because that seems to be the future. Now, electric vehicles. The network created by shared mobility services can be helpful for widespread penetration of electric vehicles. Actually, both Ola and Uber are betting big on this sector. Autonomous and connected mobility are also picking up. Although this requires a lot of investment and also availability of a lot of data, and all these things point towards use of shared mobility, the network and the customer base, and the technology infrastructure created by the shared mobility to be used for penetration of autonomous and connected mobility in India. Especially the data collected by the shared mobility providers can be leveraged for effective implementation. With this is Sam Ghosh. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.